In the summer of 1895, a team of investigators descended into the basement of a strange building on 63rd Street in Chicago. The owner had fled the city weeks before, leaving behind unpaid debts, unanswered questions, and a structure that had always unsettled the neighbors. Too many locked doors, too few windows, an endless parade of young women who checked in but never seemed to check out. The smell hit them first, a thick, sweet rot that clung to the walls and crawled into their lungs. Something chemical underneath it, sharp and wrong. They lit their lanterns and pressed forward into the darkness. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A dissection table stood in the center of the room, its wooden surface stained dark with old blood. Beside it, a rack of surgical instruments, scalpels, bone saws, forceps, arranged with the precision of a practicing surgeon. Against one wall sat a crematorium, its iron door still warm, human ash scattered across the grate. Nearby, two massive zinc tanks filled with acid, their residue tested later and found to contain traces of dissolved flesh. And in the corners, pits dug into the earthen floor, filled with quicite powder and scattered with the unmistakable white gleam of human bone. They had found what the newspapers would soon call the murder castle. But the architect of this horror was no creature from a Gothic nightmare. He was handsome, magnetic even, a doctor with gentle hands and kind eyes who could talk his way into any room and out of any suspicion. His patients trusted him. His lovers adored him. His business partners considered him a genius. Women competed for his attention. Men sought his advice. His name was Dr. H. Holmes, and he may have been America's first serial killer. How does a man of such charm become a monster of such cruelty? How does a healer build a factory of death? This presents a terrifying puzzle about the nature of evil itself. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark histories deserve to be remembered, if you believe the stories buried beneath the foundations of our past should see the light, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing. Your support keeps the candle lit and allows us to keep exploring the shadows. Tonight, we will enter the murder castle. We will trace the origins of this American nightmare from a lonely childhood in New Hampshire to the glittering chaos of the 1893 World's Fair. We will meet the women who vanished behind his smile. We will follow the detective who hunted him across a continent. And we will stand at the gallows where the devil finally met his end. This is not only the story of a killer, it is the story of the Gilded Age itself, a time when America was building its future so fast, no one noticed the monster walking among them. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand the monster, you must first understand the world that made him. You must understand the name he tried so desperately to escape. He was born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in the small town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. It was a quiet place, nestled among rolling hills and dense forests, far from the chaos of the cities that would later become his hunting ground. The Mudgett family was respectable, not wealthy, but not poor. They owned their land. They attended church. They believed in hard work and the ever-present threat of divine judgment. His father, Levi Horton Mudgett, was a farmer and the local postmaster. He was a cold man, quick to anger, quicker to punish. His mother, Theodate Page Price, was a devout Methodist who believed that children were born sinful and needed the fear of God beaten into them before they could be saved. The home was not a place of warmth or laughter. It was a place of rules, silence, and the constant awareness that someone was always watching, always judging. Young Herman was different from the other children in Gilmanton. Everyone could see it. He learned to read before he started school. He devoured books while other boys played in the fields and chased each other through the woods. His teachers called him gifted. His parents called him strange. The other children simply avoided him. There was something in his eyes, they said, something too old, too knowing for a boy his age. He smiled when he should have cried. He watched when he should have played. He spent his childhood alone, wandering the forests, collecting the bodies of small animals he found dead in the underbrush. He would bring them home and dissect them on the back porch, carefully separating muscle from bone, studying how the pieces fit together. His mother found this disturbing. His father found it wasteful. Neither thought to ask what it meant. Herman had no friends. The isolation was complete. And a brilliant mind, left to grow in darkness, can twist into something unrecognizable. Then came the incident that would change everything. A group of local boys had noticed Herman's fear of the doctor's office. Like many children, he was terrified of illness, of pain, of the strange instruments the physician used. The bullies decided to teach him a lesson he would never forget. They grabbed him after school one autumn afternoon, dragging him kicking and struggling through the streets of Gilmanton. They forced him through the door of the town physician's office, past the startled nurse, and into the back room where the doctor kept his medical specimens. And there, in the dim light, they pressed his small hands against the cold, yellow bones of a human skeleton, a teaching model, articulated and hanging from a metal stand. They expected him to scream, to cry, to beg them to stop. Instead, something awakened. Herman stopped struggling. His breathing slowed. The terror drained from his face, replaced by something else entirely. He stared at the skeleton with a fascination that bordered on reverence. He ran his fingers along the curve of the ribs, traced the hollow sockets of the eyes, examined the delicate bones of the fingers. The other boys, unnerved by his sudden calm, released him and fled. But Herman stayed. He stayed until the doctor himself found him, still standing there, still touching the bones, asking questions about how the joints connected, how the skull protected the brain, how the body could be reduced to such clean, white architecture. From that day forward, his fear was gone. In its place was an obsession, the machinery of life and death, the secrets that bones could tell, the beautiful efficiency of the human body, and the fascinating process of its destruction. At 17, Herman enrolled at the University of Vermont. By 20, he had transferred to the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor, one of the finest medical institutions in the country. Here, he would learn the trade that would serve him for the rest of his life. He was a gifted student. His professors noted his quick mind, his steady hands, his unusual comfort around cadavers. While other students grew pale during their first dissection, Herman leaned in closer. He asked to stay late. He volunteered for the procedures others found too gruesome, but he was learning more than anatomy. Ann Arbor was where Herman discovered his true talent, the art of manipulation. He was handsome now, with piercing blue eyes and a carefully trimmed mustache. He could make anyone believe anything. Women found him irresistible. Men found him impressive. And he found that with the right words, spoken in the right tone, with the right expression of sincerity, he could convince almost anyone of almost anything. He put this talent to use in his first major scheme. Medical schools in the 1880s faced a constant shortage of cadavers for teaching. The demand far exceeded the legal supply, creating a thriving black market. Herman saw an opportunity. He began stealing corpses from the university laboratory, bodies that had already been used for teaching and were scheduled for disposal. He would disfigure them beyond recognition, dress them in ordinary clothes, and plant them in locations where they would be discovered as accident victims. Then, using forged documents and false identities, he would file life insurance claims on these supposedly deceased individuals. The insurance companies would pay out. Herman would pocket the money, and the dead, who had already been dead, would be buried again, their silence eternal. It was elegant, it was profitable, and it taught him a lesson he would never forget. With the right planning, a corpse was not a problem to be disposed of. It was an asset to be exploited. Herman graduated from medical school in 1884. He had the credentials of a healer, but healing was never his intention. In the years that followed, he drifted from town to town, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and unanswered questions. A teaching job abandoned mid-term. Debts accumulated with no intention of repayment. Pharmacy positions where inventory mysteriously vanished. Women courted with promises of marriage, then abandoned without warning. Each town brought new schemes, new victims, new skills. And there was Clara. He had married Clara Lovering in 1878, while still a student. She was a farmer's daughter from New Hampshire, simple and trusting. She believed in her husband. She waited for him while he completed his studies, then waited longer while he sought his fortune. She never stopped waiting. He never bothered to divorce her, simply stopped coming home, stopped writing, stopped acknowledging she existed. She would remain legally his wife until the day he died, never knowing the man she had married. By 1886, Herman Webster Mudgett was becoming a liability. Too many creditors were searching for him. Too many spurned women and cheated partners remembered his face. Too many questions followed his name from town to town. He needed to become someone new, someone with no past, no debts, no angry former associates, someone who could start fresh in a city where no one knew him. And so, like a snake shedding its skin, Herman Webster Mudgett transformed himself. He chose a new name, one that sounded distinguished, professional, trustworthy. A name for a man who had never failed at anything, who had never cheated anyone, who had never left a trail of victims in his wake. He became Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. The man who had been Herman Mudgett was erased. In his place stood a creation, a performance, a mask of charm and competence. Behind that mask, something cold and calculating watched the world with hungry eyes. And this new man, this Dr. Holmes, had heard stories of a city rising from the mud of Lake Michigan. A city where fortunes were made overnight, where a man could become anything he claimed to be, where the future was being built so fast that no one had time to check the foundations. Chicago was calling, and the devil answered. To understand what Holmes found in Chicago, you must first understand what Chicago was in the 1880s. And to understand Chicago, you must first understand the age that created it. They called it the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe an era that glittered like gold on the surface while hiding something darker underneath. It was a time of extremes that America had never seen before. Robber barons accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the treasuries of small nations. Rockefeller controlled the oil, Carnegie controlled the steel, Morgan controlled the money itself. These titans built mansions that rivaled European palaces, threw parties that cost more than most Americans earned in a lifetime, and bent the government to their will with casual ease. But for every mansion on Fifth Avenue, there were 1,000 tenements on the Lower East Side. For every fortune made, there were countless lives ground down in factories and mines. The same forces that created unprecedented wealth also created unprecedented misery. And beneath all of it ran a current of transformation so powerful that no one could fully comprehend it. The old rules were dissolving. The old certainties were crumbling. A farm boy could become a millionaire if he was clever and ruthless enough. A nobody could reinvent himself as a somebody with nothing more than a new suit and a confident handshake. Success was the only morality that mattered. How you achieved it was your own business. This was the world that created Chicago. And Chicago, in turn, became the purest expression of everything the Gilded Age represented, both its triumphs and its horrors. Just 20 years earlier, the Great Fire of 1871 had reduced the city to ash and rubble. 300 people dead. 100,000 homeless. The commercial heart of the Midwest, gone in a single night of flame and terror. Visitors who saw the aftermath described it as the end of the world. Block after block of smoldering ruins. The smell of smoke hanging in the air for months. But Chicago refused to die. From the ashes rose something unprecedented in human history. A city that rebuilt itself in a single generation, faster and larger than before. Architects invented new technologies, steel frames, elevators, fireproof materials, to build higher than anyone had ever thought possible. The first skyscrapers pierced the prairie sky, monuments to ambition and engineering. Railroads converged from every direction, making Chicago the crossroads of a continent. Grain from the plains, cattle from the ranges, lumber from the forests, everything passed through Chicago. And the people came. They poured in by the thousands, then the tens of thousands. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, Poland, Italy, Scandinavia. Farm boys from Indiana and Ohio seeking something more than their fathers' lives. Young women from small towns across the Midwest, drawn by the promise of employment in the new department stores and factories. Dreamers, schemers, the desperate, the ambitious, all of them flooding into a city that had no time to sort them out. By 1890, Chicago's population had exploded to over 1 million souls. It was the fastest growing city in human history, a place being built in real time, its future written fresh each day. But this explosive growth came with a cost. Chicago was a city of strangers. Neighbors didn't know each other. Families were scattered across the sprawling streets, separated by work and distance and the sheer overwhelming scale of the metropolis. Communication was slow. Letters took weeks to arrive from distant hometowns. If someone disappeared, who would notice? Who would ask questions? Who would care? The city was too busy building itself to concern itself with those who fell through the cracks. Too busy racing toward the future to look back at who might have been lost along the way. For a predator, it was paradise. Holmes arrived in Chicago in 1886 and made his way to Englewood, a respectable neighborhood on the city's south side. It was home to working families and small businesses, the perfect place for a young doctor to establish himself. He found work at a pharmacy on the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets. The owner was an elderly widow named Mrs. E. S. Holton, whose husband had recently died. She was overwhelmed, grieving, struggling to manage the business alone, desperate for help she could trust. Holmes was everything she needed. He was charming, professional, endlessly helpful. He worked long hours without complaint. He was wonderful with customers. He had ideas for improving the business, for expanding, for making more money. Within weeks, Mrs. Holton trusted him completely. She began to see him as the son she never had. Then, one day, Mrs. Holton simply vanished. When customers asked where she had gone, Holmes had a ready answer. The poor widow had decided to move to California, he explained with appropriate sadness. She wanted to live with relatives, to escape the memories of her late husband. The grief had simply been too much. She had sold him the pharmacy and left to start fresh. It made perfect sense. Everyone accepted it. Why wouldn't they? Dr. Holmes was so sincere, so sympathetic. Mrs. Holton was never seen or heard from again. No letters arrived from California. No relatives came to collect her belongings. Just silence, stretching into years. Holmes now owned the pharmacy. He had learned an important lesson about Chicago. In a city of strangers, making someone disappear was as simple as telling a convincing story about where they had gone. Across the street from his new pharmacy stood an empty lot. Most men would have seen dirt and weeds, an eyesore waiting to be developed. Holmes saw something else entirely. He saw destiny. By 1890, the entire city was buzzing with excitement. Chicago had won the bid to host the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition, a World's Fair celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. It would be the largest event in the nation's history. 27 million visitors were expected. The eyes of the entire world would be on Chicago. Holmes understood exactly what this meant. Millions of visitors would need places to stay. Young women would flock to the city, seeking employment at the fair or the businesses that served it. Tourists would arrive with money in their pockets and trust in their hearts. Most would be strangers, far from home, far from anyone who might notice if they never returned. He purchased the empty lot and announced that he was building a hotel. He called it the World's Fair Hotel. It would be 3 stories tall, occupying nearly an entire city block, shops and businesses on the ground floor, apartments and hotel rooms above, a respectable establishment for respectable guests. He hired contractors to do the work, but he employed a method that would later become infamous. He never let any single crew see the complete plans. One team would build a section, then be fired before they could understand how it connected to the rest of the building. He claimed dissatisfaction with their work. Another team would take over, equally confused, and they too would be dismissed before the picture became clear. Carpenters built rooms with no apparent purpose. Plumbers installed pipes that connected to nothing. Electricians wired fixtures in walls with no doors. Each worker saw only their small piece of the puzzle. Only Holmes understood the full design. And he had another trick. He ordered building materials on credit from dozens of different suppliers: lumber, bricks, fixtures, furnishings, and rarely paid. When creditors came calling, he would charm them, promise payment next week, next month. By the time they realized he would never pay, he had moved on to the next supplier, the next scheme. The building was constructed largely with stolen materials, rising on a foundation of fraud. By 1892, the structure was nearly complete. From the outside, it looked ordinary, a large, somewhat awkward commercial building, unremarkable in a city full of new construction. But this was no ordinary building. This was no ordinary hotel. Because what Holmes had designed wasn't meant for guests who would check out. It was a machine with soundproof rooms, with gas lines running to sealed chambers, with secret passages and hidden doors and chutes that led directly to the basement. And in that basement, he had constructed something unprecedented. A workshop designed not to create, but to destroy. To process human beings as efficiently as a factory processes steel. The murder castle was ready. And just blocks away, the greatest fair the world had ever seen was about to open its gates. The building that rose on 63rd Street was a masterpiece of misdirection. From the outside, it looked like any other commercial block in Englewood. 3 stories of brick and stone, with shops on the ground floor and apartments above. A pharmacy, a jewelry store, a restaurant, legitimate businesses that provided cover and income. Customers came and went without suspicion. Neighbors noticed nothing unusual. But the upper floors told a different story. Here was a maze of over 60 rooms, connected by hallways that turned at odd angles and led to unexpected dead ends. Some doors opened onto brick walls. Others opened onto steep drops. Staircases led nowhere. The layout seemed designed by a madman, or by someone with a very specific purpose in mind, because this confusion was intentional. Every wrong turn, every dead end, every disorienting corridor served to trap, confuse, and control. A guest who entered these halls would quickly become lost, and in her confusion, she would become vulnerable. Certain rooms had no windows. Their walls were lined with asbestos and layers of soundproofing material. Once the door closed behind you, no scream would ever escape. You could pound on the walls until your fists bled, and the shopkeepers below would hear nothing. You could cry out for help until your voice gave out, and the world would never know. Gas lines ran through the walls, connected to jets inside these sealed chambers. From his private office on the 3rd floor, Holmes had installed a custom control panel with valves and gauges. With a simple turn of his wrist, he could flood any room with gas while its occupants slept. They would drift away peacefully, never knowing what was happening, never understanding why they couldn't wake up. Hidden within the walls were narrow passages, just wide enough for a man to move unseen from room to room. Peepholes drilled at strategic points allowed observation of the guest rooms. Holmes could watch his victims for days without their knowledge, studying their habits, learning their routines, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, the bodies had somewhere to go. Greased chutes ran from the upper floors directly to the basement, wide enough to slide a human body. A victim killed on the 3rd floor could be in the basement within seconds, without anyone in the building being the wiser. No carrying bodies through hallways, no risk of being seen, just a quick slide into darkness. What awaited in that darkness was the final stage of Holmes's machine. The basement of the murder castle was a workshop of death, designed with the cold efficiency of a slaughterhouse. In the center stood a surgical table, its wooden surface scarred and stained from years of use. Beside it, a rack of medical instruments, scalpels, bone saws, forceps, retractors, each one clean and sharp, arranged with a surgeon's precision. Holmes's medical training had finally found its true purpose. Not healing, but harvesting. Not saving lives, but ending them with professional skill. Against one wall sat a crematorium, custom built to Holmes's specifications. The kiln was large enough to accommodate a full-grown human body, and it burned hot enough to reduce bone to powder within hours. When the burning was complete, the ashes could be scattered anywhere, in the garden, in the trash, in the lake. Nothing left to identify, nothing left to mourn. Nearby stood two massive zinc tanks, each large enough to hold a person. These were filled with acid and corrosive chemicals, substances that could dissolve flesh and bone over the course of several days, leaving nothing behind but a residue that could be washed down the drain. A body submerged in these vats would simply cease to exist, molecule by molecule, until there was nothing left to prove it had ever been. In the corners of the basement, Holmes had dug pits into the earthen floor and filled them with quicklime, calcium oxide, a chemical that consumed soft tissue and accelerated decomposition. Any remains that couldn't be burned or dissolved could be buried here, the quicklime erasing the evidence while Holmes went about his business above. And there was one more apparatus, a stretching rack that could be used to prepare skeletons for articulation. Holmes had maintained his connections from medical school. He knew that teaching hospitals and physicians were always seeking anatomical specimens. A clean, properly articulated skeleton could fetch a good price on the medical black market. Why waste a body when it could be sold? The castle was not merely a place where murders happened. It was a factory, optimized for the efficient processing of human beings from start to finish. Victims entered through the front door, lured by promises of employment or lodging. Their assets were stripped away, bank accounts emptied, jewelry stolen, life insurance policies collected. Their bodies were destroyed in the basement, and what remained was sold for profit. Nothing was wasted. Everything was monetized. Murder had become a business. A predator of this kind is never entirely alone. Even the most careful killer needs hands to help with the work, eyes to watch for danger, mouths that can be trusted to stay silent. Holmes gathered around him a small circle of accomplices, not friends, never friends, but tools to be used and discarded when their usefulness ended. Benjamin Pitezel was a carpenter who had helped construct the castle. He was not a bright man, alcoholic, easily manipulated, perpetually desperate for money to support his wife and 5 children. He had seen enough during the construction to know that the building's purpose was not entirely legitimate, but he was too weak and too dependent on Holmes's wages to ask questions. He became a general assistant, handling odd jobs, running errands, keeping secrets. He trusted Holmes completely, and that trust would eventually cost him everything. Charles Chappell was an articulator, a man who specialized in preparing skeletons for medical use. Holmes brought him bodies, claiming they were legitimate cadavers from hospitals or medical schools. Chappell asked few questions. He stripped the flesh, cleaned the bones, wired the skeletons together, and accepted his payment. If he suspected the bodies came from somewhere other than a hospital morgue, he never said so. There were others, janitors hired to clean strange stains, workmen who stumbled upon locked doors and were warned never to speak of them, women who served as secretaries and assistants, and sometimes lovers. Most didn't last long. Those who saw too much, who asked too many questions, who threatened to become liabilities, they disappeared like all the others. Holmes cycled through employees the way other men cycled through shirts. Each one believed they were special, trusted, indispensable. Each one was simply waiting for their usefulness to end. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Holmes was not his cruelty, but his capacity for compartmentalization. He did not live one double life. He lived half a dozen, each sealed off from the others, each complete with its own identity, its own relationships, its own web of lies. There was Clara, his first wife, still waiting for him in New Hampshire. He had never divorced her, never told her about his new life in Chicago. As far as she knew, her husband was simply delayed in his career, working hard to establish himself, planning to send for her any day now. She waited for years. There was Myrta Belknap, whom Holmes married in 1887, bigamously of course, since Clara still lived. Myrta bore him a daughter, Lucy, and lived in Wilmette, a suburb north of the city. She knew her husband as a successful businessman, a loving father, a respectable member of the community. She had no idea about the castle, about the other women, about any of it. Holmes visited her on weekends, played with his daughter, maintained the fiction of a normal family life. And there was Georgiana Yoke, whom Holmes married in 1894, his third simultaneous wife. She was young and pretty, from a respectable Indiana family. She knew him as Henry Howard, a businessman with interests in real estate. She traveled with him during his final schemes, believing herself to be on an extended honeymoon, never suspecting that she was married to a monster. 3 wives, 3 separate lives, 3 elaborate fictions maintained in parallel. It required extraordinary organizational skill, remembering which lies he had told to which woman, keeping the stories straight, ensuring that none of them ever crossed paths or compared notes. And it required something else: a complete absence of guilt. Normal people cannot maintain such deceptions because their conscience rebels, because the weight of their lies becomes unbearable, because they feel something for the people they are deceiving. Holmes felt nothing. To him, his wives were simply resources to be managed, props in a performance, tools that served various purposes. When one was no longer useful, she could be discarded. When another offered new advantages, she could be acquired. Love was just another word for manipulation. Behind the charming smile, the kind eyes, the gentle manner, behind all of it, there was nothing. An emptiness where a soul should have been. A void that he filled with schemes and victims, and the endless performance of being human. The castle was ready. The machine was built, its gears oiled, its furnace stoked. And in May 1893, the perfect hunting season arrived. The greatest fair the world had ever seen opened its gates just blocks away, and 27 million visitors poured into Chicago. Thousands of young women arrived seeking opportunity, seeking employment, seeking a better life. They found advertisements for respectable lodging and good-paying positions. They found a charming doctor who promised them exactly what they needed. They found the murder castle, and the spider waited at the center of his web. On May 1st, 1893, President Grover Cleveland pressed a golden telegraph key, and the world's Columbian Exposition sprang to life. They called it the White City, and from the moment the gates opened, visitors understood why. Here was a fantasy made real, a dream built in plaster and steel. Neoclassical buildings stretched across 600 acres of what had been swampland just 2 years before. their facades covered in white stucco that gleamed in the sun like marble palaces transported from ancient Rome. Columns and domes and triumphal arches rose against the prairie sky. Fountains erupted in carefully choreographed displays. A choir of thousands sang as the flag was raised. For the millions who passed through its gates, the fair was overwhelming in its scale and beauty. There was the Ferris wheel, the first ever built, towering 264 feet above the fairgrounds, its 36 cars each carrying 60 passengers high above the city. There were electric lights everywhere, thousands of them, transforming night into day in an age when most Americans had never seen a single light bulb. There were moving pictures, demonstrated by Thomas Edison himself. There were telephones and phonographs and machines that seemed to promise a future of limitless possibility. The Midway Plaisance offered a mile of entertainment and spectacle. Little Egypt performed her scandalous belly dance, shocking Victorian audiences and becoming an overnight sensation. Villages recreated daily life in Java, Egypt, Ireland, and Samoa. Visitors tasted strange new foods: hamburgers served on buns, a caramel-coated popcorn called Cracker Jack, a chocolate confection called the brownie. For visitors from small towns across America, people who had never left their home counties, who had never seen a building taller than 3 stories, the fair was nothing less than a glimpse of heaven. Many wept at the sheer beauty of it. They would speak of those days for the rest of their lives, telling their children and grandchildren about the summer they visited the White City. Over its 6-month run, 27 million people passed through the gates. Nearly half the population of the entire United States came to Chicago that summer. It was the greatest spectacle the world had ever seen. But the White City was a fantasy, temporary, made of plaster and horsehair, designed to dazzle and then disappear. The real Chicago surrounded it on all sides. And the real Chicago was something else entirely. Just beyond the fair's pristine boundaries, the city churned with poverty, crime, and chaos. Inside the fairgrounds, electric lights, clean streets, police officers on every corner. Outside, gas lamps flickering in dark alleys, mud and garbage in the roads, criminals prowling for marks. Inside, gleaming palaces celebrating the triumph of human progress. Outside, tenements where families of 10 shared 2 rooms, where children worked 16-hour days in factories, where the American dream looked nothing like the posters promised. The contrast was jarring, almost cruel. The White City existed to prove that humanity could build paradise on earth. The neighborhoods surrounding it proved that most of humanity would never be allowed inside. And in the chaos of that summer, predators flourished. Pickpockets worked the fairgrounds in organized teams. Con men ran every scheme imaginable, fleecing tourists who had saved for years to make the trip. Prostitutes solicited openly on the streets. The police were overwhelmed and, in many cases, corrupt. For those who knew how to exploit the situation, Chicago offered endless opportunities. Young women were particularly vulnerable. They arrived by the thousands, seeking employment at the fair or the businesses that served it. They came from farm towns in Iowa and factory cities in Ohio, from small villages in Indiana and Kansas. Most had never been away from their families before. They knew no one in Chicago. They had nowhere to turn if something went wrong. Many found legitimate work. They became waitresses and shop clerks, ticket sellers and exhibition guides. They sent money home to their families and wrote enthusiastic letters about the wonders they had seen. But others were not so fortunate. Some fell into exploitation, working for starvation wages, trapped in boarding houses they couldn't afford to leave. Some disappeared into the city's underworld, swallowed by forces they didn't understand until it was too late. And some answered advertisements promising good wages and respectable lodging. Advertisements placed by a charming doctor who seemed to offer exactly what they needed. They found their way to a building on 63rd Street, just a short trolley ride from the fairgrounds. They met Dr. H. Holmes, who was kind and professional, who offered them jobs and rooms and a chance at a better life. They moved into the murder castle, and they were never seen again. We must pause here and do something that history has often failed to do. We must leave the mind of the killer. We must stop speaking of schemes and machines, of traps and techniques. We must instead remember why any of this matters, why the story of H. Holmes is not truly his story at all, but the story of the people he destroyed. Because the true measure of any atrocity is not the cleverness of the monster, but the humanity of the victims. They were not props in his performance. They were not statistics in a body count. They were human beings with families who loved them, with dreams they would never fulfill, with futures that were stolen from them by a man they trusted. Their stories deserve to be told. Julia Smythe was 27 years old when she married Ned Connor, and she knew almost immediately that she had made a terrible mistake. Ned was controlling, cold, more interested in his own ambitions than in his wife's happiness. Their marriage became a prison of quiet desperation. The only light in Julia's life was her daughter, Pearl, a bright, curious 8-year-old with her mother's dark eyes and an infectious laugh that could fill any room. In 1890, seeking a fresh start, the Connors moved to Chicago. Both found work at a pharmacy in Englewood, owned by a charming young doctor named H. Holmes. For Julia, the job was a lifeline, a chance to earn her own money, to build some independence from her suffocating marriage. And then she met him. Holmes saw Julia's unhappiness the way a wolf sees a wounded deer. He recognized her vulnerability, her hunger for affection, her desperate need to believe that life could be better. He turned his full attention on her, listening to her troubles, sympathizing with her complaints about Ned, telling her she deserved so much more than the life she had. The affair began within weeks. Julia fell completely under his spell. Here was a man who actually seemed to care about her, who treated her like she mattered, who promised a future of love and prosperity. When Holmes suggested that she would be better off without Ned, she agreed. When he offered to convince Ned to leave, she was grateful. Holmes made Ned an offer. Leave Chicago, leave your wife, and I'll forgive the debts you owe me. Ned, who had never much cared for Julia anyway, accepted. He vanished from their lives without looking back. Julia and Pearl moved into the castle. Julia believed she was starting a new chapter, that she and Holmes would marry, that Pearl would finally have a real father, that their future would be bright and beautiful. Then she discovered she was pregnant. Julia was overjoyed. A new baby, a new life with the man she loved. She told Holmes the news, expecting him to share her happiness. His expression didn't change. His voice remained calm, but something shifted behind his eyes. A calculation, a reassessment. A pregnant mistress was a complication. Holmes was already married to Clara. already involved with other women in Chicago, already maintaining half a dozen deceptions that required his full attention. A baby would tie him down, create obligations, limit his freedom. He offered to help. He was a doctor, after all. He could perform a simple procedure, and the problem would disappear. Julia trusted him. How could she not? He had saved her from her terrible marriage. He had promised her the world. She went to his operating room in the castle, lay down on his table, and closed her eyes. She never opened them again. Whether Holmes botched the abortion intentionally or simply didn't care about the outcome, the result was the same. Julia Connor died on his table, her body added to the collection in the basement. And then there was Pearl, 8-year-old Pearl, suddenly motherless, full of questions about where her mama had gone. Pearl, who had seen Dr. Holmes coming and going at all hours. Pearl, who might remember things, might tell people, might become a problem. She disappeared the same night as her mother. Her body was never found. Emmeline was 24 years old, with golden hair and a gentle disposition that made everyone who met her want to protect her. She had grown up in Lafayette, Indiana, the beloved daughter of a respectable family who had sacrificed to give her an education. She was bright, hard-working, determined to make something of herself in a world that offered limited opportunities to young women. She worked as a stenographer at the Keeley Institute, a sanitarium in Dwight, Illinois, that treated alcoholism and drug addiction. It was respectable work, steady, if not glamorous. Her family was proud of her. She sent money home when she could. Her future seemed secure, if modest. Then a letter arrived that would change everything. A successful Chicago businessman named Dr. H. Holmes needed a personal secretary. He had heard of her excellent work through a mutual acquaintance, a former patient at the sanitarium who spoke highly of her skills and character. The salary was generous, far more than she was earning now. The position was prestigious, working directly for a respected physician, an entrepreneur. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. Emmeline accepted immediately. She gave notice at the sanitarium, said goodbye to her colleagues, and packed her belongings for the journey to Chicago. Her family was thrilled for her. A position with a doctor in Chicago, it was more than they had dared to hope for their daughter. She arrived in late 1891 and took a room in Holmes's building on 63rd Street. She began work the next day and found her employer to be everything the letter had promised. He was professional, courteous, genuinely interested in her opinions and well-being. He asked about her family, remembered the details of their conversations, treated her with a respect she had rarely experienced from employers. She wrote enthusiastic letters home. The city was exciting, so different from small-town Indiana. The work was interesting. She was learning about business, about real estate, about the wider world. And Dr. Holmes was wonderful. She had never met anyone quite like him. Within months, they were engaged. It happened gradually, imperceptibly, the same way all of Holmes's seductions happened. A kind word here, a thoughtful gesture there. He made her feel special, valued, seen. He spoke of a future together, of the life they would build, of the family they might have. Emmeline, who had never expected romance to find her, fell completely in love. She wrote to her parents about the wedding plans. She described the home they would share, the happiness she had found. She was in love, truly in love, for what she believed was the first time in her life. Then the letters stopped. At first, her family wasn't worried. She was busy, probably. Engaged life was hectic. Wedding preparations were consuming, but weeks passed without word. Then months. They wrote to her, but received no reply. They wrote to Dr. Holmes, asking about their daughter. He responded with sympathy and concern. Unfortunately, Emmeline had left suddenly. She had received an offer of marriage from a man she met at the fair, and she had eloped without telling anyone. He was as surprised as they were. He hoped she was happy. Her family didn't believe it. Emmeline would never leave without saying goodbye, never abandon them for a stranger. They traveled to Chicago, searched for her, questioned everyone who might have known her. They never found her. Years later, investigators discovered a small room in the castle, airtight, soundproofed, connected to gas lines. The interior walls bore scratch marks, long desperate gouges left by fingernails clawing at the surfaces. Someone had been locked inside that room, had tried to escape, had died trying. Whether this was Emmeline's final prison, no one can prove. But someone died there. Someone spent their last hours in darkness and terror, knowing that no one could hear their screams. Minnie Williams was not beautiful. She knew this, had always known it. She was plain-faced and slightly overweight, the kind of woman that suitors overlooked in favor of her prettier friends. But Minnie had something better than beauty. She had money. Her family had owned property in Fort Worth, Texas, land that had become valuable as the city grew. When her parents died, Minnie inherited everything, an estate worth roughly $50,000, an enormous sum in 1893. She was teaching school in Boston when she met a charming businessman named Henry Gordon. He was handsome, attentive, fascinated by her intelligence rather than disappointed by her appearance. For the first time in her life, Minnie felt desired. The man, of course, was Holmes, operating under yet another false name. The courtship was whirlwind. Love letters arrived daily. Gifts appeared at her door. He listened to her thoughts, validated her feelings, made her believe she was the most important person in the world. Within months, Minnie was hopelessly in love. Holmes convinced her to transfer her Texas property to him. For protection, he said, for their future together. She signed everything over without hesitation. Her fortune was now his. Minnie moved to Chicago to be near her beloved. She lived in the castle, worked in one of his businesses, waited patiently for the wedding he kept promising. She was deliriously happy. In July 1893, her sister Anna came to visit. Anna was different from Minnie. She was sharper, more skeptical, less easily charmed. From the moment she met Dr. Holmes, something about him bothered her. His smile was too smooth. His answers to her questions were too practiced. She noticed inconsistencies in his stories, gaps in his explanations of his business dealings. She asked too many questions. She looked too closely. Anna Williams disappeared first. Holmes told Minnie that Anna had returned to Texas suddenly. A family emergency, nothing to worry about. Minnie, trusting her beloved, accepted the explanation. Weeks later, Minnie disappeared as well. Holmes would later claim that Minnie had killed Anna in a jealous rage, and that he had helped her flee to Europe to escape justice. It was a lie, of course, one of dozens he would tell about the sisters. The Texas property was sold. The money vanished into his accounts. Two sisters from Fort Worth became two more silent graves in the basement of the murder castle. Beyond these names, Julia, Pearl, Emmeline, Minnie, Anna, there were others, so many others. Employees who noticed strange things in the castle and asked the wrong questions. Boarders who paid for rooms and were never seen checking out. Young women who answered advertisements and never wrote home again. travelers passing through Chicago who stopped at the wrong hotel. Holmes would eventually claim 27 victims in his confession. Investigators who examined the castle believed the true number was far higher, perhaps 50, perhaps 100, perhaps more. The crematorium had been used extensively. The acid vats had been refilled again and again. The quicklime pits contained bone fragments from multiple individuals. Most of his victims have no names. Their identities were destroyed along with their bodies, burned, dissolved, scattered. They exist only as fragments of bone, as shadows in the historical record, as anonymous entries in the long catalogue of the lost. They were daughters and sisters. They were dreamers who came to Chicago seeking something better. They trusted a man with a kind smile and a professional manner, and they paid for that trust with their lives. For years, Holmes operated in the shadow of progress. The White City celebrated humanity's triumph over darkness, while the darkness fed just blocks away. But every predator eventually makes a mistake. Every monster eventually grows too bold, too confident, too certain of his own invincibility. Holmes had killed the daughters of families with no power, no connections, no ability to demand answers. But soon, driven by greed, he would make an error that no amount of charm could undo. He would kill people whose deaths could not be ignored, and a relentless detective would follow his trail across a continent, uncovering horrors that would shake a nation to its core. By 1894, the walls were closing in. The World's Fair had ended. The tourists had gone home. Chicago was settling back into its ordinary rhythms, and the chaos that had provided such perfect cover for Holmes's activities was fading. Worse, the debts were catching up. Creditors were filing lawsuits over unpaid bills from the castle's construction. Suppliers were demanding payment for materials that had been ordered years ago. Insurance companies were comparing notes, noticing that an unusual number of young women connected to Dr. Holmes had died under suspicious circumstances, and the families were asking questions. The Sigrans wanted to know what had happened to Emmeline. Other relatives were searching for daughters and sisters who had last been seen in Englewood. Local police were beginning to take interest. Chicago was no longer safe. The castle, once his fortress, was becoming a trap. Holmes needed money, enough to disappear, to start fresh somewhere new, to build a new identity in a city where no one knew his face. He needed one final score. He turned to an old associate, Benjamin Pitezel, the carpenter who had helped build the castle, who had remained loyal through years of schemes and secrets. Pitezel was desperate, as always, drinking heavily, barely able to support his wife Carrie and their 5 children. He would do anything Holmes asked. The plan was simple. Pitezel would take out a $10,000 life insurance policy, naming Holmes as a secret beneficiary. Then, they would fake Pitezel's death, substituting a disfigured corpse that could pass as him. They would collect the insurance money and split it. Pitezel would assume a new identity and disappear. Everyone would win. Pitezel agreed. He trusted Holmes. After all these years, after everything they had done together, how could he not? He signed the insurance papers. He rented a house in Philadelphia, posing as an inventor named B.F. Perry. He waited for Holmes to arrive with the substitute corpse and the plan for staging the accident. Holmes arrived, but he hadn't brought a substitute corpse. He had brought chloroform. Why split $10,000 when you could keep it all? A dead partner couldn't demand his share, and Peter Zell, poor foolish Peter Zell, had outlived his usefulness. On September 4th, 1894, the body of B.F. Perry was discovered in the rented Philadelphia house. The face had been badly burned, apparently from an accidental explosion during a chemistry experiment. Documents in the room established his identity. The insurance company investigated briefly, then paid out the claim, $10,000. All of it Holmes's now, but there was a loose end, a very dangerous loose end. Carrie Peter Zell knew about the insurance scheme. She was waiting for her husband to emerge from hiding, for the money to be divided, for their family's fortunes to finally turn around. She had 5 children depending on her: Dessie, Alice, Nellie, Howard, and the baby. She trusted Dr. Holmes to make everything right. Holmes visited her with terrible news and a generous offer. Benjamin was alive, he explained, but he couldn't reveal himself yet. The insurance investigation was still ongoing. Any contact with his family might expose the fraud. But in the meantime, Holmes would help. He would take 3 of the children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, and bring them to their father in a safe location. The family would be reunited soon. Carrie was exhausted, overwhelmed, desperate to believe him. She agreed. What followed was one of the cruelest chapters in a life defined by cruelty. Holmes took the 3 children, Alice, 15, Nellie, 11, and Howard, 8, and began moving them from city to city across the eastern half of the country. Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Detroit, Toronto, always cheap hotels and boarding houses, always a new city before they could get comfortable, always promises that Papa was just ahead, that they would see him soon. Meanwhile, Carrie Peter Zell followed a separate route led by Holmes's instructions. She traveled to city after city, always arriving just after her children had left, always missing them by days or hours. Holmes kept the 2 groups perpetually apart, each believing the other was just ahead. Alice wrote letters to her mother constantly. She poured her heart onto the page, her loneliness, her confusion, her growing fear that something was terribly wrong. "We have been in so many places that I can't remember them all. I wish I could see you. I don't like to be away from home so long. I get so lonesome without you all." Holmes kept every letter. He never mailed a single one. In Indianapolis, Holmes rented a small house on a quiet street. He brought Howard inside, just the 2 of them. The boy was 8 years old, small for his age, trusting as only a child can be. Howard never came out. Holmes would later confess that he killed the boy in that house. He described placing Howard in a trunk and suffocating him, then burning the small body in the wood stove. He offered this information without emotion, without remorse, as if describing the disposal of unwanted furniture. He continued north with Alice and Nellie, the 2 girls unaware that their brother was dead. They arrived in Toronto in late October 1894. Holmes rented a house on St. Vincent Street and told the neighbors he was putting in a potato cellar. He dug a hole in the basement, 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, just large enough for 2 children's bodies. One night, while the girls slept, Holmes connected a gas line to their room. The hissing of the gas was quiet, almost gentle. They never woke up. They died in each other's arms, the older sister holding the younger, both of them dreaming of the reunion with their parents that would never come. He buried them in the cellar he had prepared. Holmes might have escaped entirely if not for a single stubborn man. Frank Geyer was 50 years old when he took on the case that would define his career. He had spent 3 decades with the Philadelphia Police Department, working his way up from patrolman to detective through sheer persistence and an unshakable commitment to the truth. He was not a flashy investigator. He didn't rely on hunches or dramatic breakthroughs. He believed in methodical work, in following every lead, no matter how unpromising, in never giving up on a case until every possibility had been exhausted. He was assigned to find the missing Pittersell children in the spring of 1895, and from the beginning, he understood the magnitude of the task. The trail was ice cold. Holmes had used dozens of aliases during his travels: H. Howard, Henry Gordon, George Williams, and a dozen others. He had moved constantly, rarely staying in one city for more than a few days. He had paid cash, left false forwarding addresses, and covered his tracks with the skill of a man who had been evading consequences his entire life. Months had passed since the children had vanished. There was no physical evidence, no witnesses who had come forward, no clear indication of where they had been taken or what had happened to them. Most detectives would have concluded that the children were simply gone, lost in the vastness of the American landscape, impossible to find. The case would have been filed away, the family told that nothing more could be done. Geyer refused to accept this. He began by reconstructing Holmes's movements from the insurance records and railway tickets. He traced the killer's path backward, city by city, hotel by hotel. In each location, he showed photographs of Holmes and the children to every hotel clerk, every landlord, every shopkeeper who might have noticed them. He studied rental agreements, looking for properties that Holmes might have used. He interviewed hundreds of people, most of whom remembered nothing useful. The work was tedious and exhausting. The summer of 1895 was one of the hottest on record, and Geyer spent it traveling from city to city in sweltering train cars, walking from address to address in the brutal heat, asking the same questions over and over. He slept in cheap hotels and ate at railway stations. He wrote detailed reports every night, documenting his progress, never losing track of the threads he was following. Weeks passed, then months. The trail led to Cincinnati, then Indianapolis, then Detroit. In each city, Geyer found traces of Holmes, hotel registers with his aliases, landlords who vaguely remembered a man matching his description, but the children themselves remained ghosts. Then, finally, in Toronto, he caught a break. A real estate agent remembered renting a house to a man matching Holmes's description. The man had been accompanied by 2 young girls. He had asked specifically about the basement, whether it was private, whether neighbors could see in. At the time, it had seemed like an odd question. Now, it seemed sinister. Geyer went to the house on St. Vincent Street. The current tenants allowed him to search. He examined every room, every closet, every corner. He found nothing. Then, he went to the basement. He noticed that part of the floor seemed different. The earth had been disturbed, then packed down again. He borrowed a shovel and began to dig. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. 2 small skeletons, intertwined in the earth. The remains of Alice and Nellie Pittersell, dead for nearly a year, buried in the cellar of a rented house by the man their mother had trusted with their lives. Geyer wept when he uncovered them. Then he straightened his shoulders and continued his work. He traced Holmes to Indianapolis, to another rented house on another quiet street. In the chimney of the wood stove, he found fragments of bone and teeth, charred buttons from a child's clothing, the remains of 8-year-old Howard Peetzel. Holmes had already been arrested by this point, picked up in Boston on fraud charges related to the insurance scheme. Now the charges would be upgraded. Now the world would learn what kind of monster had been walking among them. With Holmes in custody for the Peetzel murders, investigators turned their attention to Chicago. The stories about the strange building on 63rd Street had circulated for years, but no one had ever had the authority to look inside. Now they did. The first teams to enter the castle were not prepared for what they found. The ground floor seemed normal enough, a pharmacy, some shops, offices, but the upper floors were a labyrinth of confusion. Hallways doubled back on themselves. Doors opened onto brick walls. Rooms had no apparent purpose. It seemed like the work of a madman. Then they found the hidden spaces. Behind a wall on the 3rd floor, a small room, airtight, with gas lines running through the ceiling and scratch marks gouged into the interior of the door. Behind another wall, a chute leading down through the building into darkness. They followed the chutes to the basement. The smell hit them first. Old death, chemicals, something that had been rotting for a very long time. They lit their lanterns and pressed forward into a space that seemed designed in hell. The dissection table stood in the center of the room, its wooden surface scarred and stained from years of use. The investigators noted the grooves worn into the wood, the channels carved to direct fluids, the leather straps still attached to the corners. This was not a table for healing. This was a table for taking apart. The surgical instruments hung on a rack nearby. Scalpels, bone saws, forceps, retractors, each one clean and sharp, arranged with a surgeon's precision. These were professional tools, medical instruments used for medical purposes. The investigators were trained men, experienced with the grimmer aspects of their work. But something about the careful arrangement of those tools, the obvious care that had been taken to maintain them, made their blood run cold. Against one wall sat the crematorium, a custom-built kiln large enough to accommodate a human body. The iron door stood open, revealing ash and fragments of bone still scattered across the grate. The mortar between the bricks was discolored from heat. This furnace had been used extensively, over and over, for purposes that required no explanation. Nearby stood 2 massive zinc tanks, each large enough to hold a person. The investigators approached carefully, unsure what they would find. The tanks were mostly empty now, but a residue clung to the interior surfaces, a yellowish slime that reeked of chemicals. Samples were taken for analysis. The results would confirm what everyone already suspected. The residue contained traces of dissolved human tissue. In the corners of the basement, they found the pits, holes dug into the earthen floor, filled with quicklime and scattered with bones. Too many bones, ribs and vertebrae and fragments of skull, all mixed together in the calcium powder, all belonging to different individuals. Some of the bones had been burned. Others showed saw marks. A complete accounting was impossible. They found a ball of women's hair, tangled together, pulled from multiple heads over what must have been years. They found clothing hidden in walls, dresses, undergarments, shoes, the last possessions of women who had vanished into the castle and never emerged. They found articulated skeletons, prepared for sale, that may once have been living, breathing human beings who trusted Dr. Holmes. The investigators tried to count the victims. They found evidence of at least 9, possibly more. But Holmes's methods had been thorough. Most of the bodies had been completely destroyed, burned, dissolved, scattered. A complete count was impossible. The newspapers descended on the story with Gothic abandon. The Castle of Horrors, modern Bluebeard's Den, the archfiend of the century. Every paper in America ran the story. Artists rendered imaginary scenes of torture and murder. Reporters interviewed anyone who had ever met Holmes. The nation was consumed with horror and fascination in equal measure. In August 1895, just weeks after the investigation concluded, a mysterious fire broke out in the castle. The upper floors were gutted before firefighters could bring the blaze under control. Evidence that might have answered lingering questions was destroyed forever. Arson was suspected, but never proven. Perhaps Holmes had allies who wanted to destroy evidence of their own involvement. Perhaps it was simply an accident. The castle kept its final secrets, but enough had been discovered. Enough had been documented. Enough had been proven to ensure that H. Holmes would face justice. The question now was what form that justice would take, and whether any punishment could ever be proportionate to the magnitude of his crimes. The trial of H. Holmes began in Philadelphia in October 1895, and from the first day, it became a national sensation. He was not charged with the castle murders. Those crimes had occurred in a different jurisdiction, and the evidence, while horrifying, was largely circumstantial. Instead, he faced trial for a single killing: the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, his former partner, the man he had killed for $10,000, and the convenience of silence. It was the strongest case available. There was a body. There was an insurance policy naming Holmes as beneficiary. There was testimony from the surviving Pitezel family members. There was the physical evidence recovered from Toronto and Indianapolis, the children's remains, the tools used to dispose of them. And there were Holmes's own lies, his web of deceptions that had collapsed spectacularly under the weight of Detective Guyer's investigation. Holmes, characteristically, insisted on representing himself. The court reluctantly agreed, though the judge warned him that defending oneself against a capital charge was foolish. Holmes smiled and said he understood the risks. He had been talking his way out of trouble his entire life. Why should this be any different? And so the nation witnessed the surreal spectacle of a serial killer cross-examining the witnesses to his own crimes, playing attorney in a trial where his life hung in the balance. He was theatrical in the courtroom, charming when it suited him, indignant when the moment called for outrage. He objected to evidence with the confidence of an experienced litigator. He questioned witnesses with surprising skill, probing for inconsistencies, suggesting alternative interpretations of the facts. He made dramatic speeches to the jury, proclaiming his innocence, portraying himself as a victim of circumstance and overzealous prosecution. There were moments when observers forgot what he was accused of, when his intelligence and charisma made them understand, just for an instant, how he had fooled so many people for so long. He was performing, always performing, and even with his life at stake, he couldn't stop. But the evidence was overwhelming, and no amount of charm could overcome it. Witness after witness took the stand to describe Holmes's lies, his schemes, his cruelty. Hotel clerks remembered him checking in with children who never checked out. Landlords described his strange interest in basements and furnaces. Insurance agents detailed the suspicious circumstances of the Pittersell policy. Detective Geyer walked the jury through his months-long investigation, the methodical reconstruction of Holmes's journey of murder. The most devastating testimony came from Carrie Pitzel. She took the stand and described in halting words how Holmes had convinced her to trust him with her children, how he had led her on a nightmare chase across half a continent while he murdered Alice, Nellie, and Howard one by one, how she had believed, until the very end, that her children were alive and waiting for her. The jury watched her break down on the stand. They watched her try to describe the moment she learned what Holmes had done to her family. The deliberation took less than 3 hours. On November 2nd, 1895, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. In the months before his execution, Holmes wrote a confession. He sold it to the Hearst newspaper chain for a substantial sum, ever the businessman, monetizing even his own crimes. The confession was published in April 1896, and it caused a sensation. Holmes claimed 27 murders. He provided names, locations, methods. He described victims who had been gassed in sealed rooms, poisoned with various compounds, suffocated and strangled and dissected. He presented himself as a man driven by dark compulsion, unable to resist the urge to kill, but even his confession was unreliable. Some of the victims he named were later found to be alive, having never encountered Holmes at all. Other murders that investigators had confirmed were omitted entirely from his account. Dates and locations contradicted physical evidence. The confession seemed designed not to reveal the truth, but to obscure it, to create a legend larger than reality, to ensure that the name H. Holmes would live in infamy. Even facing the gallows, he couldn't stop performing. Even with nothing left to gain, he couldn't resist the manipulation. The true count of his victims will never be known. Scholars who have studied the evidence carefully estimate that at least 9 murders can be confirmed with reasonable certainty. Some believe the actual number may be higher, 20, 30, perhaps more. Speculation has ranged as high as 200, though such figures are almost certainly exaggerated. The truth died with Holmes, buried in the quicklime pits and scattered as ash across the Chicago wind. What made H. Holmes? It is a question that has fascinated and horrified people for more than a century, and it has no satisfying answer. Modern psychiatry would likely diagnose him as a psychopath, a person characterized by superficial charm, pathological lying, lack of empathy, and a complete absence of remorse. He displayed every trait in the clinical literature. He could mimic human emotion flawlessly without experiencing any of it. He could look a mother in the eye and promise to care for her children while already planning their murders. His victims trusted him until the moment he killed them, and he felt nothing for any of them. But diagnosis is not explanation. We can label what Holmes was without truly understanding why. Perhaps the coldness of his childhood, the isolation from human connection, stunted some essential capacity for empathy. Perhaps his early fascination with death and anatomy normalized what should have been horrifying. Perhaps the ease with which he manipulated everyone around him convinced him that other people were merely objects to be used. Perhaps he was simply born with something missing, some essential piece of humanity that the rest of us take for granted. Holmes himself offered no insight. His explanation shifted constantly depending on his audience. He was a victim of circumstances. He was possessed by the devil. He was misunderstood. He was proud of his achievements. He was sorry for nothing. Each story was another performance, another mask, another lie. Perhaps the answer lies not in Holmes himself, but in the world that enabled him. The Gilded Age was an era of unprecedented change, cities exploding in size, fortunes made overnight, old certainties dissolving into chaos. It was a time when a man could reinvent himself completely, when the past could be erased with a change of name and a move to a new city, when success was the only morality that mattered. Holmes was the shadow of the American dream, the nightmare lurking inside the promise of self-invention, the price of a world that asked no questions and demanded no accountability. He thrived because Chicago let him thrive, because the city of strangers provided him with an endless supply of isolated, trusting victims, because everyone was too busy building the future to notice what was being buried in the foundations. Holmes spent his final months in Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, awaiting his execution. By all accounts, he was a model prisoner, calm, cooperative, even cheerful. He received visitors, wrote letters, discussed philosophy with the guards. He showed no apparent fear of death, no remorse for his crimes, no interest in making peace with the world he was about to leave. He reportedly converted to Catholicism in his final weeks, making confession to a priest. Whether this represented genuine spiritual transformation or merely another performance, one last manipulation of people who wanted to believe in redemption, is impossible to know. Holmes kept his masks until the very end. He made one unusual request, that after his execution, his body be buried in a coffin filled with concrete, within a grave lined with cement, 10 feet underground. He claimed he feared being dissected by doctors, his remains put on display for a mocking public. It was an ironic concern for a man who had dissected so many others, who had sold their skeletons to medical schools for profit. But perhaps there was another motivation. Holmes, the master manipulator, wanted to control the narrative even after death. He would not give the world access to his remains. He would not allow anyone else to decide what happened to his body. The authorities granted his request. On May 7th, 1896, H. Holmes walked to the gallows. It was a clear day. A small crowd of officials and journalists had gathered to witness the execution. Holmes climbed the steps with steady strides. He stood on the trap door, the noose placed around his neck, and was asked if he had any final words. "Take your time," he told the hangman. "Don't bungle it." At 10:13 in the morning, the trap door opened, but the rope did not break his neck cleanly. Instead of a quick death, Holmes dangled at the end of the rope, twitching and convulsing, slowly strangling. It took 15 agonizing minutes for his heart to stop beating. Even in death, nothing went smoothly for H. Holmes. He was buried as he had requested, encased in concrete, sealed in cement, 10 feet below the surface of Holy Cross Cemetery in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. If there is a hell, he descended to it. If there is nothing after death, he simply ceased to exist, which may have been all he ever truly believed. The murder castle did not long survive its creator. The mysterious fire had already gutted the upper floors. In the years that followed, the building was demolished entirely and replaced by a post office, a mundane structure that gave no hint of the horrors that had once occupied the site. Today, nothing remains of the castle. The address exists, but the building is gone. A legend grew up around Holmes in the decades after his death. Stories circulated that he had cursed everyone involved in his capture and trial. Several people connected to the case did die under unusual circumstances in the following years. a detective from a sudden illness, a witness in an accident, a journalist under mysterious circumstances. Whether this represents supernatural vengeance, mere coincidence, or simply the normal mortality of human beings is a matter of belief rather than evidence. The story of the murder castle entered American folklore. Holmes became a dark icon, his name synonymous with the hidden monster lurking beneath a charming surface. Books were written, legends embellished, facts distorted into myth. The man who had worked so hard to craft his own image in life continued to be crafted by others after death. Even the empty lot where the castle once stood drew visitors for decades. People came to stare at the ground as if the earth itself retained some memory of what had happened there. They came to shiver, to imagine, to connect themselves to a story of horror that had become part of the national consciousness. The story of H. Holmes is, on its surface, the story of a single monster, a man with no conscience and no remorse, who killed for profit and pleasure and the simple exercise of power. But it is also the story of the world that made him possible. Holmes was a product of the Gilded Age, that strange, terrible, exhilarating period when America was transforming itself faster than anyone had thought possible. Cities exploded in size. Fortunes were made overnight. The old rules, the old certainties, the old ways of knowing your neighbors and being known by them, all of it was dissolving into something new and strange and frightening. It was an age of reinvention. A man could shed his past like a snake sheds its skin. He could move to a new city, adopt a new name, create a new identity from whole cloth. For most people, this was liberation, the freedom to become whoever they wanted to be, unshackled from the circumstances of their birth. For Holmes, it was opportunity. Chicago in the 1890s was a city of strangers. More than 1 million people thrown together from every corner of the world, struggling to build lives in an overwhelming metropolis. Neighbors didn't know each other. Families were scattered across the sprawling streets. A person could disappear, and in the chaos of construction and commerce and daily survival, no one would notice for weeks or months or ever. Holmes exploited this anonymity with terrible efficiency. He built his castle blocks from the White City, that monument to human progress, and he filled it with the bodies of progress's forgotten casualties. While America celebrated its bright future, the devil fed in its shadow. There is a lesson here, though it is not a comfortable one. Every era of rapid change creates chaos, and in chaos, predators thrive. The same forces that enable innovation and opportunity also enable exploitation and horror. The same anonymity that frees people to reinvent themselves also frees monsters to hide in plain sight. Holmes was not an aberration. He was a possibility, the dark inverse of the American dream, the nightmare lurking inside the promise of self-invention. We are fascinated by him more than a century later because we recognize something in his story. Our own cities are full of strangers. Our own identities are fluid, reinvented daily on screens and profiles. We live in an age of unprecedented connection that somehow also feels deeply anonymous. We meet people online who claim to be whatever they want to be, and we have no way of knowing whether any of it is true. Could another Holmes be walking among us now, operating through different technologies, exploiting different vulnerabilities, building a different kind of murder castle, in the architecture of our networked world? The uncomfortable answer is almost certainly yes. The specific details change. The fundamental dynamics remain. Where there are strangers who cannot verify each other's identities, where there are vulnerable people searching for connection or opportunity, where there is chaos that prevents accountability, there will always be predators who exploit the situation. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for vigilance. But we should also remember something else about the story of H. Holmes. The victims came to Chicago seeking better lives. They trusted a man who seemed to offer exactly what they needed. They disappeared into a building designed to erase them from the world. We remember the killer's name. We rarely remember theirs. Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl, Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie and Anna Williams, Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pittersell, and the dozens of others whose names have been lost entirely, whose identities were destroyed along with their bodies, who exist now only as bone fragments in quicklime pits and ash scattered on the wind. They were not props in the story of their killer. They were human beings with hopes and dreams, and families who loved them. They deserved lives that were stolen from them. They deserved to be remembered as more than victims. The monster has achieved a kind of immortality. His name lives on, spoken with horror and fascination. His legend grows with each retelling. His victims have been largely forgotten. That is, perhaps, the final injustice. Let us try, at least here, to reverse it. Let us remember that the story of H. Holmes is not truly his story at all. It belongs to the innocent, the women and children consumed by a darkness they never saw coming, in a city too busy building the future to notice what was being buried in the foundations. And let us remember too that the foundations of our own future are being built right now, in this moment, by forces too vast and rapid for any of us to fully comprehend. We would be wise to look carefully at what and who might be hidden inside them. If you found this journey into the shadows of American history meaningful, consider subscribing to the Midnight Archives. We explore the dark corners of our past not to glorify evil, but to understand it, and to remember those who were lost to it. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. What do you believe created H. Holmes? And what does his story tell us about our own age? Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, the monsters of history are worth studying precisely because they remind us that monsters are always, in the end, terribly human. Thank you for watching.